So what I want to do should be, again, just a helpful reminder. I always like to just double click on my scene file that's right in Perforce and open up that project in Unity. So when I double click on this hub.unity, Unity is going to load that exact project. So just a helpful trick to make sure you're working in the correct project. It's very common. You can have multiple projects, and if you don't rename your project template, you might be working in the wrong one. So here you can also tell here, it tells you Unity, the version you're using, and then, the scene you're in, hub.unity, and then here is the name of the project. So this is also a way you can reference if you're working in the correct project. So now that I have the hub scene loaded, I'm going to go ahead and open up the IND229 folder here. So inside the scenes folder, right, inside scenes, this holds your hub and your danger zone. And here you'll see this level design folder, which you'll be using next month. We'll have the IND229, right? Inside here, we have the other scenes you'll be working on. So you have the entryway and the wind turbine. Those are related. And then rigid bodies is going to be for week 4. So we can go ahead and drag the IND2 underscore wind turbine scene into the hub. All right, so you'll see it's that same similar platform. So before I actually start working on anything, I'm going to come to Perforce and actually check out the files that I'm going to be changing. So for right now, all I'm going to be working on is just the wind turbine scene. So I'm going to check out the scene and the meta file. I can shift select both of them and hit checkout. And then this is not a trap. You can't type here. Don't click. Just hit OK, or you can even turn this off. All this is saying is going to your default change list. All right, so I'll see over here now in my pending change list, I have 2 files checked out, ready to be worked on. All right, so I'm going to come to Perforce, and I'll show you what we're going to be working on. Inside the IND229 underscore content folder, you see this entryway folder. This has everything you're going to need to complete this assignment. So you can go ahead and get latest on this folder itself if you haven't gotten latest on the whole content folder already. So these experiments right here is what we're going to be going over today. So the very first one should be straightforward and not too difficult to follow along with if you want to follow along in Unity. All we're going to be talking about is creating a complex game object. So this should be similar, creating a complex game object and then creating a prefab from there. But why this is important is because we're going to be setting up an actual animation using Unity's Mechanim system and using their animation tools. So this hierarchy is actually going to matter about what's the child and parent relationship to certain objects. The second experiment we're going to go over is just talking about the animation system, how to actually set up different animation clips, how to put keyframes in those animations, how to adjust your graphs, because surprise, animation is all math, to get that result that you want. That's what's going to be experiment number 2. Experiment number 3, we're going to take that interaction that we've made and then create a trigger volume. So players can walk into it, press E, and that animation will play in correspondence. As well as we'll get some audio tied in there. So when they actually press E, we're going to get some player feedback so the player knows that their commands are being accepted. So a lot of information to go over in 1 2-hour lecture. This is going to be recorded. So try and bear with me and follow along. If you want to follow along in Unity, you can. But just know that I'm not going to be stopping to come answer questions. That's what lab will be for. But I will give everyone a brief moment at the end of each experiment to at least get caught up or ask any questions. All right? So getting into the first experiment, going back to Unity. All we're going to be doing is just creating that complex game object to get ready to animate. So for this, we can actually remove the hub. We're only going to need this one scene here that we're working in. And now the first thing I'm going to do is just create a 3D game object. I'm going to go ahead and create a sphere. All right? And now in the inspector, I'm going to make sure that this is set to the origin. Or, sorry, 0, 0, 0, not 1, 1, 1. Because I want to build my complex game object with a very clean transform here. And that's going to become very important. Better? Yeah, there we go. So having this clean transform, especially the scale, making sure you have a clean scale value is very important when you actually go to apply animation to this. And I'll show you an example of what can go wrong if you go ahead and scale certain objects that you try to animate. So now that we have the sphere, I'm going to go ahead and rename this and call this pivot. The next thing I'm going to do is just create another 3D object. Let's go ahead and create a capsule. And let's put this at the origin as well. Now I'm just going to adjust these scale values here to give it a value of 3 in the Y and 0.25 in the Z. Just something to make a little bit more resemblant of a blade. So let's go ahead and call it that. Let's call it blade. And then pretty straightforward, we're just going to go ahead and duplicate this 2 times. So Control D twice. And now in your hierarchy you see I have 3 of them. And right now they're all on top of each other, right? You duplicate them in their exact same location. I'm going to take one blade, rotate this 60 degrees in the Z. Select another blade, rotate this one negative 60 in the Z. Right, now you have this interesting flower looking shape. And now you'll notice you may have your widget on your object be either oriented to the world or to the actual object. And you'll see as I click this button up here right next to center, that's what's actually controlling if the transform widget is oriented to the world or to the object itself. When I went over the level blocking message, remember I talked about this button here. It can toggle between the center or the pivot of the object, right? If I create a level blocking cube and I toggle this is going from the center to the pivot of the object, which you can set up, and we're going to go over creating custom pivots here soon. So that's what that can toggle. This one here is going to be the direction that you can move objects, right? It makes it much easier when you start to move it on the y-axis of this object, right? Because I can very easily just slide this in place. Right, get it about where I want to. And if you want to go back here and actually get those round values, it's a good idea. So if I wanted to actually try to move it this way, it's definitely possible. But you'll notice I have to make much more movements and clicks with my mouse. And that can end up being more time, right? The longer it takes you to do things like this, the more time you're wasting. So having this quick button here will allow you to just easily manipulate it into place for each one. All right, so now we have our blades in place where we want them to. We can go ahead and just round these. All right, cool. So let's go to our hierarchy, and now this should all be a review, right? I'm just going to make the pivot the parent object of all of the blades, right? So I'm going to go ahead and select all my blades and just drag and drop into the pivot, right? Now you see that little arrow pops up. Now I can, drop that, minimize or maximize that list, and now you'll see when I select the pivot object, everything else gets selected, so I can move it as one whole unit. And now if your pivot is up here in this awkward position, that's again this center or pivot option, right? You want to select the center of this sphere. And now we can go ahead and test this. This is a really good time to actually test this to make sure it's working as intended. So just go ahead and rotate the pivot object. Make sure the blades are moving as you want them to. So if I go ahead and duplicate this, and now real quickly, I'm going to pull these blades out. You don't have to do this. I'm just going to show a test. Say I took this pivot here and I scaled it, right? This one's going to be a little bit bigger. And now I just drag these blades back in here. Now this may perform normally, but yeah, it does. I'm going to leave this one here as an example because if you start to have other scale values in here, you'll see things like that. See how as I scale this up, it starts to stretch all the children as well. And now when I try and rotate, it'll also behave a little awkwardly. So be careful about having these scale values in here and see how it will affect all the children. So whatever you do to the parent is going to affect everything. So I think maybe because I chose all clean values, it didn't affect it. But if I did something other than that, it will start to warp and skew all of the children. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and save my scene real quick. All right, so now I've got this part set up. I'm going to go ahead and create the base for this to rest on. So first thing I'm going to do is just create a 3D game object. Let's create a cube. Let's call this head. Put this at the origin. Oh, looks like this got moved. And this you can really, put as much or little effort into this as you want. We're really just building something that would represent how this would function. When we get into actually building the entryway and building a doorway, I really want you to start to think about how this would really be constructed in a real world. So it doesn't have to be exact, but at least try and make it something believable. All right, so then I'm also just going to create a cylinder. Let's call this stalk. And let's go ahead and move this into position. Let's scale this up. I like to do 10 is good, just so nothing too tall that the player needs to move up when we go to test this. Like move the camera up when it all in the shot. So good enough, right? Not perfect, not a AAA title asset by any means, but it's going to function. Then when we get it functioning, you can go in and actually replace the asset itself with something else visually. But right, so now we want to set up another parent-child relationship. So when I move the stalk around, I want the head to move as well, right? So I'm just going to drag the head, drop it inside the stalk. So now that should be the case. Yep, that looks good. And now from here, I don't want to put the pivot object inside the stalk. I want to create an empty game object that's going to hold these almost as a container, right? So empty game objects are a really good way to set your pivot location where you want to, right in the engine, as well as do some cool things with the animation, which we're going to get into. So I'm going to go ahead and just right here, there's the shortcut menu here, right? This create is the same thing as over here if you go to game object. So I'm going to go create empty. I'm going to call this wind turbine. This is basically going to be the root container of everything. All right. So this is, you'll see in the inspector, this is just an empty game object. It just has a transform. If you want to do some people like to use these little icons. It's totally up to you. They're not necessary, but you'll see this is basically just a visual representation in the engine of this wind turbine. That's just an empty object. So if that helps you to help you understand it, by all means use it. It's not going to show up in game or anything, but that's right here, this little icon. And then to turn it off, you just hit none. All right, so now I have this empty game object. I'm going to drag my stalk and my pivot, right? Just control select both of them and drag and drop them in the wind turbine. All right. Again, I'm going to do a test. I always like to test this. You never know what can break. Just rotate the pivot. Make sure nothing's skewing or breaking. Make sure the whole stalk isn't moving with it, but it looks like it's rotating normally. Now you'll see if I grab the wind turbine object and just move it, right, rotate this, everything moves together, one whole unit. A small little issue with this right now is notice where this wind turbine game object is, right? It's at that 0, 0, 0 location, which is fine, but when we actually go and place this in the world, we want to put it down here at the base of the game object. Makes it easy to drop multiple in the world or to place them in the environment. So what we can do is we can move the child objects, and the parent objects aren't going to move. The parent objects aren't going to move when we make any type of manipulation to the children. So you'll see I can grab the pivot and the stalk and move them. And now if I select that wind turbine, it's still in the same place. Right? So what we want to do is get the base of the cylinder to the origin, right? So by you holding down control, you get the very easy use of snapping, and now I can get it right down to that center point very easily, right? So now when I select the wind turbine, notice it's in the exact same place. I'll go ahead and throw that little tag on so you can see it. That never moved, right? That's always in the same location. So you can affect the children and the parents don't get affected. But when the parent moves, everything else goes with it. Should be review. But why that's important is when we get to actual animation, which you'll see in the second experiment. So I'm just going ahead and save my scene here. And let's go ahead and make a prefab out of this. So if you want to put these assets in your project, you can do so in any means. For the sake of the assignment and just still trying to understand Perforce, I'm going to go ahead and create a folder. You don't have to do this, but just a good practice just to understand where files are going on your computer. So let's just call this wind turbine experiments. So everything we use for these experiments, I'm going to put in this folder. Not how you're actually going to do it on a normal professional project, but still, just to stay organized for now, I'm just going to keep everything in this folder. So I'm going to grab the wind turbine here. Let's open up this folder and drag and drop that right in there. Right, now we've got a prefab of that object. Right, so now I can start to place multiple of these, and as I was saying, because the pivot's down there, it just conveniently snaps to the ground or to other faces of other objects. All right. So that's the wrap-up of the first experiment, right? So just save the scene. We've got this prefab now. Let's go back to Perforce. And this part is definitely important. Don't skip over this. Right, we've got these files checked out here, so I'm going to submit those. But also remember, I just added a prefab, right? So I added an asset to my project. If I look in my assets folder, go ahead and refresh, here's that wind turbine experiments folder. So I'm going to mark this for add. Right, and I'm going to go ahead and grab this wind turbine experiments.meta folder, meta file that goes with the folder itself. Looks like there's some other things in my project I haven't yet added, so I'll definitely make sure I add those before I'm done with the lecture. All right, so I'm just going to do write a brief description of what you did if you'd like to, but definitely include just the phrase of completed wind turbine experiment 01. So when you complete the ILA assignment, this isn't actually until next Thursday. Yeah, next Thursday this is actually due, but I like to show you guys this early because one, it's a lot of information, and two, I'm hoping that you see this now and then next week you review it or actually complete the work and it's a refresher. So just more exposure to it, you'll pick it up more naturally. So when you do this, make sure you submit to Perforce 3 times. So I'm going to go ahead and just complete wind turbine experiment 1, hit submit, because what you're going to end up doing for the ILA is you're going to come to your assets folder here. In the history, you'll see your descriptions here. It'll say completed wind turbine experiment 1, 2, and 3. You're just going to take a screenshot of this and turn this into Perforce. So the wind turbine experiments aren't graded. It's required for the ILA, but it's all going to come when we actually build the entryway, right? Because everything we're learning here is going to be directly applied to completing the entryway assignment. So that's what you're going to do, is you're just going to take a screenshot of this when you're all completed. Any questions at all so far about the first experiment? No? Hopefully it's a review? Cool. All right, now we're going to get into some of the fun stuff. Any questions at all from the online folks? Should be able to hear you if you have any questions. All right, so let's go ahead and keep going if there's no questions. So again, just very quickly, come back to Perforce. I'm going to, a lot of this is really just understanding what it is you're changing. Back when I was, in the Unity lab a little while ago, I was helping a student, and he was a similar issue, like he couldn't get his door to function. And I was like, all right, well, let's go look at the script where this functionality was happening. And the student said to me, he goes, well, how do I know I wrote that script? And I just kind of scratched my head, and I'm like, well, did you write the script, or did you not? And he just couldn't remember what he actually did. So the moral of that is just to always be conscious of the changes you're making. It's hard to wrap your head around at first, but think to yourself, all right, what is it that I'm actually going to do? If I'm just going to add some things to a scene, all you need to do is check out that scene in the meta file. If you're going to modify a script, right, you're going to need to check out that, or if you're writing a new script, you're going to need to come to Perforce and mark it for add. So just always be aware and try and always stay conscious of the changes you're making. So I'm going to just come here and again check out this scene in the meta file, as well as I'm going to come to the wind turbine experiments folder, and I'm just going to go ahead and check out the whole folder. All right, back in Unity. See, Perforce isn't that scary. I was only in there for a few seconds, I promise. All right, so moving on to the second experiment. Now we're going to actually apply some animations to this object. So to do so, you'll see here in the window menu, there's two windows we're going to utilize, this animation and animator. All right, they sound similar and they're utilized, one works off the other. The animation window is where you actually create the animation clips, right? So we can put keyframes, we can set what's going to happen in the animation itself. The animator is where we take those clips themselves and set the transition. How do I go from my idle state to my walking state? How do I go from the on to the off state, right? We get to set those conditions and set different parameters to allow them to happen when we want them to. So we're going to start in the animation window. This little window would pop up here, and you're going to see here it says no animatable object selected. Anybody have an idea what we want to do? Select the object we want to animate. And what's the specific object that we want to have our animator on? The sphere, right? The pivot object right here. So putting the animator on the correct object is important. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to come to my pivot object. I like to do this when you get the more complex animations. It's important you do things like this, and artists do things like this all the time. I'm just going to put animate me right on this object. So I remember this one has my animator, right? You can also do things like on your prefab, or the one you can do things like master, if that helps. So it's important to not put your animator on the root object. I'll explain why that's important here in a second, but it's definitely going to be a big step to transitioning to level design, is setting these up properly. So now you see when I select the object, it says to begin animating, create an animator and an animation clip, right? So I just hit create down here, and now I'm creating the first clip of this animation. So here it's already putting it in the correct folder. Make sure you're putting it in the right location or where you want it to. Now I'm going to call this first clip idle. All right, we'll go ahead, and now the clip has been created. You'll see in your project something else has been created, right? Here's that idle clip I just created. Here is the animation controller, right? This is going to hold all of our transitions and all of our states that we're going to be building once we have all of the clips in place. All right, so now you'll see in the animation window itself, you'll see these buttons at the top, right? So this record, when this is turned on, you'll notice your play, pause, and skip buttons up top turn red. This is just a big warning sign telling you that anything that you change in the editor right now is going to be recorded in this window. So you can go ahead and turn that off if you don't want to make any changes that will impact your animation. Now, obviously, play right here, you can just preview your animation. Here you can skip from the beginning to the end, or from keyframe to keyframe. Here you can add a keyframe, one of the many ways to do so. And here you can add an animation event, which we're going to talk about next week, that really gives you a lot of control and versatility and allow your design to shine through just little events that happen at certain points in the animation. So we have our idle selected. Next thing we need to do is add a property, right? So I'm going to add the property here. Now take a look at what we have access to. Now I'm going to show you the hierarchy at the same time, just so you understand why the animator can be pretty important, how we set this up. So when we go ahead and add the property, first in the inspector, let me select the pivot. Select this guy. So now when I add the property, see here we have a transform, right? Here's that transform right here. Here's the sphere collider, which is right here. The mesh renderer, which is, right here. You can see we're rinsing and repeating. We see all of the components of this certain object. So if I add a light component to this, I can now animate that light right in this animation. So you see these. Does anyone know what these three are? They're the blades, but do you have a guess why they're showing up? Let me go back. Yep, because they're the child object of your pivot object. So if you think about this for an entryway or a doorway like that, if you have a handle be the child object of your door, you can have one animation that turns the handle and the door opens. You don't need separate animations. You don't need separate animators, and that can be very complex. If you have everything that's moving as its own animator, gets way out of hand. But if you set up your hierarchy to where everything is contained as a child of the object that's being animated, you'll have access to all of that. So hard to wrap your head around at first, but a very simple example like that of just a door with a handle. Your handle is a child object. You can have that rotate, then the door open. Is a good starting point. So we're not gonna utilize the children yet, but start to think about that, and if you want to mess around with it, feel free. So I'm gonna go ahead and just add a transform. I'm just adding that property here, so we're just gonna mess with the rotation. All right, and you'll see that Unity immediately adds 2 keyframes for me, right? One at the beginning, one at the end of the clip. All right, so we're done. We are now animators, right? We've done it. Not quite, not super interesting, but this is going to be our first state. So a little bit about this window, a little bit more about it. You can use the mouse wheel to scroll to see more of the timeline, so you're not just stuck to 1 second of animation. I commonly see students do that where they have this really cool plan and this awesome idea, but they don't ever explore outside of 1 second, so you're just forcing a lot of action in one. It's just not enough time. So what to do is you can drag the final keyframe at the end, just drag this out, and you'll see that the darker gray bar turns lighter, and that shows you the length of the clip itself. All right. This red bar here, this represents where you are in time. So it's another thing that's a little bit wonky to understand, but when you move this, you're moving to a different point in the clip itself, right? So I want to come to the end and make an adjustment, and then when I play, you can see that result happening. So what we're looking at here, this menu, this is referred to as a dope sheet, because what this shows you is just locations of keyframes in time. Right? If I drop this down, I can see the values of these keyframes, but really the best way to animate is by looking at graphs. So this graph is not going to be very interesting at all because it's no movement at all, but does everybody remember what slope is, what the slope of a line is? Yeah? Who said yeah? Can you tell me what the slope of that line is? Okay, it's just a completely flat line. 0, right? So the slope of the line is 0. So basically, the closer you are to 0, that's 0 movement. That's going to be no movement. The sharper your slope, the faster the movement. So let's go ahead and actually add some movement to this. And to do so, let's go ahead and create another clip. So right here, I can hit this little drop-down list, go create new clip. And now let's call this spinning. Save it. Add a property again. So again, we're just going to work on the rotation. All right, so now here, we want this to spin from 0 to 360 degrees. All right, so I'm going to drag my red bar here all the way to the end. And now there's multiple ways you can do this. You could come to the editor and actually rotate it. You can, select it here. Make sure you select the actual one. And then come to the inspector and type in the value. You can come to here and type in the value itself. Right? A lot of ways to do it. And you'll see how the text boxes turn that salmon color. This is common. Maya does the exact same thing. I think Max uses the same color. But this just represents these attributes have keyframes on them. So sometimes that'll be important. You'll be like, why is this thing not moving? Or why is this thing constantly moving? You might recognize, oh, there's a keyframe where it shouldn't be. So, I like to just come to this right here and type in the value I want. But as I said, lots of ways to do the same thing. You'll see it immediately updates. And now, with that, we can go ahead and play and see what we've got. So just how the editor works, it's going to basically, as soon as the animation ends, it's going to play it from the beginning again. So that's why it appears to be looping right now, is because it's just constantly playing from the beginning to the end. So now if we look at the slope of this, let's select the Z itself and then just hit F. Right? What can you tell me about that slope? You don't have to tell me the value, but what about it? What can you tell me about it? It's steady, right? There's no change. It's constantly the same value from beginning to end, right? That's why we have a constant motion. So to adjust how this is going to look, or right, to adjust that like in animations they're referred to like slow ins and slow outs, you're going to start to adjust the slope of the line or the tangents of these points. Right? So I'm going to pause this for right now. If you come to the curves tab itself, right, and right click on any keyframe you put, or any point on your graph, you'll see you can have access to some controls of the tangent itself. So if I go ahead and hit flatten, it's just going to make that point, the tangent in and out, it makes basically that point, its slope is 0. Right? So now if I go ahead and adjust this graph, I want someone to see if they can tell me what the motion is going to look like. Anyone tell me what that might look like?
It'll start slow and speed.
Right, and then it'll start to wind up. Right, so this could be a good animation where if you want something to start off and then start to spin on, and then we can have it transition to a actual spinning state. Oh, it looks like I'm doing this in idle. Oh, yeah, it looks like I did all this in idle, so not a big deal. I'm just going to come to this, put this back to 0, and just go ahead and fix these tangents. Just put them back to auto to get that flat line, and then just test it again. All right, and then make sure I come back to spinning. Yeah, make sure I put this in the right location. All right, so yeah, basically you'll have control of these tangents, and you'll see this little handle here. Now you can control and manipulate it to get the movement that you want. Be careful of wobbles and things like that. That's going to cause very strange and erratic movement. So you always want to have a smooth progressing graph, but the tangents themselves are how you're going to control that motion. Right. All right, so you'll see here that this is rotating from 0 to 360 degrees. And now if I wanted this to spin slower, what's one way I could actually do that? Make it longer, right? So it's going to be traveling the same distance but over a longer period of time. Right? So now same thing, same motion, but now it's just happening over a longer period of time. And now the opposite would be if I wanted to make this faster, but I wanted it to stay 1 second, what could I do? Yeah, I can increase this, right? So I can make it do twice the distance in the same amount of time. Right? And now you'll see that this curve is much, I think my window's larger, yeah. Like that. Now the tangent itself is, or the slope is much sharper, right? Much closer to 1, right? So a slope of 1 is almost basically a vertical line. And a slope of a horizontal line is a slope of 0. All right, so now we have our two states in there, and feel free to make your, play with your motion if you want to. If you want to have more states that actually have a turn on and like a wind up and a wind down state, you can build those. That's actually what you're going to be doing for your entryway. But for right now, we're just going to have these two states, right? On and off state. So now that I'm completed with those animations, I like to close the window just in case I accidentally still record on for any reason. Now we're going to go into the animator. And now in the animator, right, at first you'll see there's nothing here. Again, you just need to select the object itself. You'll see that there's some states already here for us, right? So every animation clip that we create, Unity is creating an animation state, right? So it has these states already here for us, ready to go. What we need to do now is set up a functionality of how these are going to transition from one state to the next. So you'll see this entry state right here. What this represents is basically if on a more higher level, if this was a player or like an enemy, right, an NPC, if they were to be spawned into the world, what's that entry state? What's the state they first start out in? And then they can start to transition. You'll also see, it's always hiding on me, yep, over here to the right is the exit state. This doesn't need to be set up, but this would basically be if the object is destroyed, what is that final state it's in before it's destroyed? So it's used sparingly. The entries often use more, but that's what they are in case you're wondering. So to actually make transitions, you can just right-click on any state and set, right here, the first option, make a transition. All right, so I can click and drag. You'll see this little arrow now, and it'll snap to other states. All right, so I want to select the idle to the spinning. All right, now I have that transition. So I want to do the same thing back. So go from spinning to idle. So now this will have the functionality of being able to turn off to on to off to on. And now you'll see if I play and just go to the scene mode, you'll see that's what's happening right now. But if this auto live link isn't working for you, turn it off and then turn it back on and then close the animator window. Sometimes it's just finicky to see this actually work. I'm happy it's working the first time for me, but it's really helpful, right? Because we can actually see it go from state to state, and you'll see the transitions highlight as I go from one to the next. All right? So right now it's just going from one to the next. There's no waiting for any input or waiting for a command. That's the next thing we want to set up. So here in the animator, question?
Is there a way to make it continually, Joe?
Sure, yeah, I mean, right how it is right now, we could just do something like this, where we can, and to delete these, if you ever need to, you notice that there's no option to delete. That means you can't. You're stuck with them forever. No, I'm lying. You can just hit function delete on your keyboard, and they'll go away. So one way to make it constantly spin forever we can use the set default state machine, right? So this, when we attach it, now the spinning state is our default. So if we wanted, if you just wanted a thing in your world spinning forever, this is how you could do it. So this will just sit here and spin continuously forever, right? What we're going to set up though is a player input, turn it on and off based on a small control panel. So let's go ahead and set this idle back to our default, and let's get it back to our transitions. All right, so here are the layers. These you don't really need to mess with. You're not really going to utilize it all in this class, or probably even in this capstone, in the associate's capstone project. But basically what these are used for is, if the player goes into a crouch state, right? They now, when the player crouches and they press W, A, S, or D, they have a new movement, right? They have a walk forward, but it's a different walk than if I'm just standing up straight, right? If I'm just walking, it's a different animation. So they go into the crouch layer, right? So there's a whole new set of animations where you have a crouch walk forward, crouch strafe left, crouch strafe right, crouch walk backwards. So it goes into that crouching layer, and from there it can branch out to new animations. Same thing for like the swimming volume, right? You see in any sandbox game, the player jumps in the water. Now they're in the swimming state. Whole new, same controls, whole new set of animations. I've also seen some cool things if you see a character have like 10 to 15 different idle animations, right? He'll be idling there and then he'll like do something random and then go back to the idle. They can use layers to set up all those different transitions. Parameters we are going to use. So if you hit this little plus here, these three words should already be familiar to you: float, integer, and boolean, right? We already know what those are. We see this other one down here, which is a trigger, which is essentially just like a boolean, but allows a little bit more of a functionality. There's no true or false value. It just like happens, right? So trigger, it just happens, and then it just waits to get hit again. There's no true or false value. So I'm going to show you how to set this up with a boolean, but it can definitely be accomplished with a trigger as well. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new boolean here, and let's call this is spinning. Or no, let's call this toggle spin. Okay, so now we have this parameter here. We can mark this true or false. So if we select the different states here, select idle, select spinning, you see information in the inspector, right? So we can, if your motion ever gets broken here, right, if this isn't existing, or say you create a new state, you can just drag a motion from your project into that state. Don't really mess with much more of this. Like there is, speed and different things you can get into. Mirroring would be more for characters, and foot IK is all for characters. Really just this is, if they're ever missing a state, you can drop it in there. But if you select a transition itself, right, I'm going to select this arrow and look in the inspector. This is information about the actual transition, how I'm going from idle to spinning. So if I go ahead and add a condition, you'll see it immediately pops in that one parameter that I have. So this is only going to transition from idle to spinning when toggle spin equals true. So let's go ahead and test that and make sure that actually works. All right, so right now it's just hanging out in idle, right? It's not going to be going into that spinning state until we tell it to now. So if I hit this checkbox, I should go to spinning, right? And you'll see, because I haven't set up anything further, it immediately just goes back to idle. So it plays spinning once and then goes back to idle. And it's staying looping because this is marked. If I turn this off, it's just going to stay in idle. So now let's go to the other transition. Let's add another condition in here. Instead of toggle spin equals true, we're going to do toggle spin equals false. All right, so let's test that out. So now it's just waiting. I hit it. Now it's going to be spinning forever, right, until I mark it as false. So it's going to be hanging out there. Now it transitions. So you may notice, if you're following along, or if you're really paying attention to when I click this, you'll notice if I wait until the idle is like just beginning to play and turn this on, watch what happens. You notice how it waits for the entire animation to finish before it will actually transition. I'll try and do it again on going back. You see there how it immediately doesn't just pop into the next state. It waits for that animation to finish. That is controlled. Let me select this. That is controlled here by this exit time. So this you can get really involved with this, but it's not super important. But that's why that's happening. So if I check this off, what's going to happen is it's just going to immediately transition from one to the next. You can really get into here, and like if you set the exit time, you can like set the time it exits and like really mess around with the transitions. I don't need you to get into that. I just wanted to explain why it waits or why it's waiting for that. That's controlled by the exit time itself. So this you can basically make it shorter, make it only transition there. You can make it a little longer so it will blend them together. But if we just get it back to where it was and turn this off, you'll see that it will immediately react. It immediately just skips right into the spinning state and goes back. See, it's immediate reaction. So, all right. Any questions at all about that stuff so far? Okay, let me save my scene. I think that's everything so far. All right, so let me go ahead and just select the prefab. It's always a good habit to get into doing this often. I'm going to select this master here and then hit apply, because you'll see that I did make some changes to this, right? I did add the actual animator component, right? If I look at the pivot object, you'll see now I have this animator component. This controller here, this is this information that we're looking at. Inside the animator window, these different states, the transitions that are being affected, that is right here in this asset. So if you want to like submit this to Perforce and then work on your states again, this is the object this is the asset you're actually changing in the project. So save that. Let's go ahead and just save the project to be safe. All right, let's come back to Perforce and let's go ahead and submit. We haven't added anything new, so let's go ahead and just submit this change list. All right, I'm just going to say completed experiment. All right, so completed the second experiment. So what I'm going to showcase for the next, the final experiment is this feature here, which is called reconcile offline work. So this is definitely not something that you should be using as your common workflow. I really want you to be checking out files, working on them and then submitting, because this is very, very powerful. It's more of like an advanced technique. There's a reason why I don't show it to you on the first day. So this is definitely like a good catch-all. This will help you if things are out of whack when you get to a team setting. This will be a good thing to utilize. If you feel that you're comfortable with Perforce and you understand it, I'm not against using this, but you need to understand what you're doing before you start to mess around with this. So to showcase this, I'm not going to check anything out. I'm just going to go back into Unity and start to work normally. All right? So I'm going to come back here, and we can go ahead and put this over there for now. All right, so for the third experiment, we're going to actually set up our trigger volume, right? So you should be a little bit familiar with them already. Maybe you've written a script already to get your own functionality, but we're going to write our own script to, when the player presses E, walk into a trigger volume and press E, all we need to have happen is this turn from true to false, right? If you think about it, when the player presses E, that's what's going to happen. This true or false right here is controlling the whole animation. So when we get this to happen, everything else is going to happen as we want it. And then from there, we can add more to it, right? We can have it play sounds. We could have lights turn on and off. We can have game objects destroy. We could have particles turn on. But once we understand how to do one thing, it's just applying it to multiple others. So let's go ahead and move our prefab back over here. And now for this, I'm going to create a small little control panel. So let's just make a level blocking mesh. And this doesn't need to be anything fancy. This is just a point so we know where to test our trigger volume. Right, there's a little control panel there. Let's call this control station. Okay, now on this object, let's go ahead and create an empty on this right here. So this is going to be our control trigger. Okay, so on this game object here, let's go ahead and add a collider to this. So you could add a sphere collider, could be a capsule, could be a box collider, really doesn't matter. We just need some type of collider. Right? Hopefully you're familiar with this component here. If not, you can use this edit collider here. You'll see these little faces come up. That will allow you to basically, if it's a box collider, you'll select each face and can basically move each face into the location you want it. With a sphere, you basically can just adjust the radius. You'll see as I drag this in and out, the radius is just getting bigger or smaller. All right, so now that we have that collider, you'll see this is trigger box right here. We want to check this on. So what this is enabling us to do is utilize the functions inside of Unity's built-in API, which is onTrigger enter, onTrigger exit, and onTrigger stay. When it's referring to onTrigger enter, it's referring to this trigger right here. So if we don't check this on, that function just won't work. All right, so we want to check that on there. All right, so now we have our trigger volume. Let's go ahead and actually start to write our script. So I'm going to go ahead and add a component, and we're going to go ahead and add a new script. Let's call this control turbine. So one thing you'll notice that Unity tends to do, and I've seen this trip up a few students before, is you'll see that I just hit enter and it added this component, right? But look where it put that script. It threw it inside this, it just threw it in the assets folder. It says, I don't know, just figure it out wherever you want to put it. So I want to make sure I drag this and put this inside my wind turbine experiments folder. Right, so now I have my script, I have my prefab, I have my two animations, and I have the animation controller. Another thing it does at random side note is if you create a terrain, create 3D object terrain. Terrain is an actual asset, so you'll see it does the same thing, it just throws it in your assets folder. So don't get tripped up with that. Should I delete that? Okay, so back to where we're at. Now with my pivot object, oh, sorry, not the pivot, the control trigger, this is what has our script. I'm just going to go ahead and double click on the control turbine here to open up Visual Studios. So if you're using MonoDevelop, that's totally fine. Ever since Visual Studios was a part of Unity, I've kind of gravitated towards that. One thing that will make everyone's lives easier as well as your own is if you turn on your line numbers. So by default in Visual Studios they're off. So to get to them it's under Tools, Options, and now it's buried in here. So we go to Text Editor, All Languages, Line Numbers. Go ahead and turn that on and hit OK. And it's just be much easier for if I'm coming over to look at your script rather than seeing me saying right there, no, right there. Just I can say on line 15 or on line 20. It'll be much easier to read and much easier to decipher on your own. So turn those on. And yes, we are writing a script, so don't be afraid. We have provided basically the whole thing for you. If you scrum down to this, you can't see it now because of the projector, but this is it right here. This is what I'm going to be writing right now. I'm not going to go through and write all the comments. I'm going to explain it in my own words, but it isn't something you can just copy paste. You actually have to type this out yourself. So actually write this out and take the time to understand what's going on, because this is so integral to honestly building your entire Scraps level. You can make an awesome level out of just trigger volumes and interactions, right? It doesn't need to be on press E. It can be when the player enters, something happens. When they leave, something happens. When an object with the grav null enters, right? It's a lot of the same concepts. So definitely pay attention and don't just type it all out, line by line and then just run it. Try and actually decipher and understand what's going on. So, like I said, what we're actually doing is we're turning on this value, right? That Boolean. Go back to Unity right here in the animator. This is what we're enabling. We're turning this on and off, right? So we need to get access to, first we need to get access to this game object, right? Because this pivot underscore animate me, this object has our animator. Then once we have access to this animator, this component, we can then have access to this Boolean. Okay, so that's the first thing we need to do is get access to this animator. So what we're going to need is we're going to need a public game object. All right, I'm going to call this turbine pivot. So this could be named anything. This could be named pineapple. This could be named pickle. This could be named Billy. It really doesn't matter. As long as you understand this is just a reference to something. We can now use turbine pivot somewhere in our script, and it's going to reference this game object. All right, so just so you understand that, I'm going to go ahead and save my script. All I did was write one line. I'm going to come back to, not Perforce, Unity. And now you'll see on my script, I'm going to have that public game object exposed, right? And it's looking for a game object, right? If I hit play, I should get an error. I didn't. No. Well, if I was trying to utilize that, I get an error because there's nothing plugged in there, right? If you move forward and do the whole assignment, it won't run because it's looking for a game object, right? So because it's named turbine pivot, we want to put in our pivot object. So I'm going to drag the hierarchy here just so I can drag and drop. So I'm just going to drag my pivot object, drop it in this turbine pivot. Okay, so this is just a reference to this object. Okay, the next thing we're going to need is an animator, right? So we have an animator on our game object. We want to have an animator in our script that we can set them equal to. So I'm going to say private animator. Do you guys know the difference between public and private? Okay. And let's just call this pivot anim, right? So this is going to be the animator component of our pivot object. That's where that naming convention is coming from. All right. So inside the start function, this is basically going to happen as soon as the level loads, right, on start. We want to get access to that animator component, right, and set it equal to this one right here. So what we're going to write here is pivot anim equals. All right, so next thing we're going to write is we need to get access to this game object, right? So turbine pivot dot get component. Okay, and now this takes in the angled brackets, so put those in, and then this is also a function, so don't forget the curly braces or the parentheses. Okay, and now inside these square brackets here, we need to actually assign what component we want to get, right? So if I want to say audio source, Unity is going to yell at me now because now I'm trying to convert an animator into an audio source. So this is immediately just going to not let you do that, right? Because this pivot anim is an animator, it wants an animator, right? So we're going to go ahead and accept animator right here. Should be able to zoom in if easier to see. Oh yeah. All right, cool. All right, so now we have this pivot anim is now equal to our turbine pivot dot get component animator, right? So those now are equal to each other. So next thing we're going to need is we're going to write our on trigger enter. So it's a function, so void on trigger enter. Make sure you have capital O, capital T, and capital E. If you don't, you're not going to get an error or any type of complaint. But by using the capitals here, this is referring to the Unity's API, right? So when I have this trigger volume here, that's what the function is that's running off of that is trigger. If you just do this, Unity's not going to complain. It's just thinking you're creating a new function named on trigger enter, right? So it's not going to give you an error. It just won't run properly. All right. So in this function, you'll see if you hover over it. Oh, I need to have see curly braces. There we go. So if you take a look at this this function itself, you need to actually include the collider inside of here, right? So we're going to have our collider, and then this again is just going to be a reference. So in the assignment, you see we use the word entity. That's just, you know, another just reference. We could call this anything we want. So let's just go ahead and name something silly. Let's call it pineapple, just to show you it doesn't matter. So basically this is going to be checking for a certain collider, right? So when a collider enters this volume, we can execute this function, okay? So now, because this is just a nickname or a reference, we're going to have our if statement inside of here. So if, let's call this pineapple dot tag, and put a double equals player, and then I'm going to explain this a little bit. So here in this line on line 14, I just wrote pivot anim equals turbine pivot dot get component. But down here I'm saying if pineapple dot tag double equals player. Does anyone know the difference between a single equals and a double equals?
A single equals is assigning a value to something, and a double equals is setting something equal to something.
Is equal to.
You're close. The first one is right. A single equals is an assignment. A double equals is a comparison. So we're just checking, is pineapple's tag player? Right? So this is just checking to see if it's something. We're not changing any values or setting anything. It's just a comparison. So single is an assignment. A double is a comparison. So tags. Are you guys familiar with tags? Yes? Few? A little bit? So you'll see in Unity, come back here, you'll see basically every object in the inspector, you can set a tag and a layer, right? So if we look at our player, so let me go ahead and drop in the hub scene. And always make sure your hub is the top scene. There's a bug with the multi-scene editing that whatever scene has your camera in it needs to be the root object. You'll see some real weird, bizarre things if it's the opposite. But if we look inside our character, here's our object here. It's tagged as player, right? So we're checking this object's tag. You'll see if you hit this list, there's a bunch of other different tags, and you can create your own custom ones. So you can know if it's tagged as orange, do this. If it's tagged as blue, do this. You can have whatever type of design you can come up with based on these tags here, right? So our character is tagged as player. So basically what this is saying is this trigger volume is only going to work with something that's tagged as player, because we don't want us to throw something in it or something else enter the volume to make this go off. We only want it to happen when it's the player. Right, so let's keep going. And then, so this is just a reference. So I'm going to leave it like that, but then by the end I'll change it back to make sure it's what you'll be seeing in the actual assignment. So now inside here, let's go ahead and just put a print statement. We just want to make sure this is working, right? So I'm just going to put a small text blurb in here. The player has entered the control trigger, just so we know that this is working, right? Don't skip these steps. You really want to make sure that you're getting it right as you go along. Myself, I came to school to learn Maya and Photoshop and animation and texturing. So when I came here and they said, all right, you're learning scripting and Unity and Unreal, I'm like, all right, cool, I guess I'm doing this now. It's get used to it. It might not be new to you at first, but do it in small chunks and small doses, and then you can really do a lot with it going forward. So we've got our player. Let me move him just slightly back. Again, don't rotate him. Move him all you want, but don't rotate him. And now when I have my console up, if I play and I enter that volume, I should fail. I should see that print statement come up, right? So player has entered the volume. Good stuff. So let's go back to the script. And now we're going to use the best technique in scripting, which is copy paste. So we're going to paste this function twice. And now all we're going to change in here is on trigger stay. You're seeing it's yelling at us because it's saying you already have one. You don't need multiple. That's right. We're going to change one to stay and one to exit. And let's just give all these different just to show you it doesn't matter as long as, now it's complaining because there's no reference, but as long as these match, it can be anything. All right. So now I'm going to save this, come back to Unity, and go ahead and play. All right, now when I enter this, let me get rid of the warnings. We just see these. So take a look at these comments that are popping up, right? Notice the number on the side over here. If you hit collapse, you'll see if it may look like this where it's just running on a long list. If you hit collapse, it'll show them all very organized, and then you'll just have a number. So by looking at those numbers, you'll see that the enter happens once, one frame. As soon as I enter, that's happened one time. It doesn't happen again until I leave and then enter again. Exit only happens one time. But stay, that's just, as long as I sit there and hang out, I'm in the volume, stay is just going to keep getting checked, keep getting run over and over again. So this should tell you that that is the function that we want to have any input inside of, right? We don't want to have input in enter or exit because that means that the player would need to press E, the frame they enter, which the player doesn't really know when they're entering the volume, right? That's what we are setting up and designing, but they don't physically know where that volume is. So on trigger stay is where we want to put our actual input. Okay, so coming back, let's start working on that function itself. So on the stay, let's go ahead and add another condition to our if statement. So if we use a double ampersand, right, what this will allow us to do is check an if statement for multiple things. So we can say if the tag is player and they press E, execute this function. Another one that's helpful is on the backslash. If you hold shift and then do the backslash, those two bars, that represents or. So you could say if the tag is player or the tag is enemy, do this, right? So a little helpful trick. So we're going to use the double ampersand, and after that I'm just going to write input, and then by using the dot operator, right, the period, this will bring up a long list of basically all of the functions that can come off of this, or all of the commands that can come off of this function, right? So you can scroll through this list. If you're using something for a first time or you just want to see what your options are, use the dot operator. Just put a period and this list will pop up. We're going to go ahead and use get key up. Here you're going to see this is get key down, and get key up. Sounds super similar, right? But get key would basically be as long as it's held, something will happen. So if you want the player to be holding, you'd use get key. Get key down as soon as they press, and then get key up is when they release. Let's do a get key up, and then inside parentheses, we want to say what is the key they're pressing, right? And by doing so, we type key code, and then again the dot operator. And here you see you have every single button on your keyboard. Plus, if you set up, with a controller, you have your joysticks, things like that. We're going to go with just the standard E. That's the standard interact key for PC. So when you're doing your entryway as well, make sure you're sticking to that. Don't have it on anything else other than just press E. When you do your level, you can go nuts and have anything, but for the entryway assignment, have it as E. So now this print statement will only happen when the player's in the volume and they press E. So in here we can add a little bit more functionality. Let's go ahead and add another if statement inside of this one. So if, and what this one is going to do, what this is if statement I'm about to write, is now we're going to check for the parameter value, right? So we set this up where we have this animator, and we set this equal to this game object, but we haven't yet used it. Now we're going to actually utilize it in here and check what its value is. So if pivot anim, and again the dot operator, we're going to do a function called getBool. So we're just getting the Boolean. And now on this Boolean, if you hover over it, it's just looking for a string name. So what's the name of our string? Let's go back to Unity just to look. I have the character selected. right? Toggle spin with a lowercase t, capital S. So get bool, and then in parentheses, we just need quotes. Toggle spin. All right, and then we're going to just compare that, see if that's equal to false. All right. And then if it is, all we're going to do is set it to true, right? So we're checking to see if it's false, and if it is, we're going to set it to true. And by doing that, remember, that's just going to turn on the wind turbine. So pivot anim, and instead of get bool, we can use a command called set bool to actually just set the value of it. And now if you hover over this one, I'm going to put the parentheses, you're going to see it's looking for a string name and in the value, right? So we're going to put the value the name of the boolean we want to change, and then the value we want to set it to. So here we're going to write toggle spin, close the parentheses, and then a comma. You can see that by just hovering over that. You see string name, comma, bool val right there. That'll show you what you want to put for that function. And then here we're just going to say true. All right, and let's leave that print statement just so we know that this actually worked. And before we go forward, let's go ahead and test this and see if this works. All right, so let's go ahead and walk up to it. All right, so I can turn it on. Now I'm in that spinning state, and I can't yet turn it off, right? So you see when I pressed E, that toggle spin turned to true, but I haven't yet set up the functionality to where it will go back to false. To do so, we just need to add one small little interaction in here. So what we're going to do from here is add what's called an else statement, right? So we're going to check this main if statement down here to see if it's set to false. Go ahead and do this. What the else statement is going to basically say is, if it's not set to false, what is it set to? True, right? So if it's not set to false, our else statement is going to run, right? So if that is the case, inside here, all we need to do is set this to false, right? So I'm going to copy these two lines here. Set this to false. So this else statement is only ever going to run when it already is equal to true, right? So here we're checking if it's equal to false, and then if it is, set it to true. And this else statement is by basically doing this. I'm going to just copy it, and I'll paste it here, and then comment it out, just so you understand. That is what this else is doing, this line right here, right? And you'll see in the assignment we just have it listed out as it's, but if the toggle spin parameter is currently true. That is what this else is checking, right? We're going to set it to false. Let me just change these so it says the player has, say, activated the wind turbine. And then I'll just change this to deactivated. So now I should be able to turn it on and off. Let's see if that actually works. And we should see that toggle spin the value there right in the animator. So when I hit E, you'll see it turns on. And then when I press E again, it immediately turns off. All right, and it should be able to just do this infinitely, forever. All right, so we've made progress so far. We're not yet done. We're going to add in some audio, but let me go ahead and submit to Perforce just so I don't lose this awesome work I've done so far. So that's a good mindset to be in. It's like when you get something that you finally accomplished, right? You've finally figured out how to get it to work, or you've fixed this bug, submit it to Perforce so you don't ever lose it. So remember that I didn't actually check anything out. So that's not a good habit to get into, but in case that happens, it's all right. You can still get your work onto the depot. So what I'm going to do is showcase reconcile offline work, right? So I didn't check anything out, but I made some changes. I want to submit my work to the depot. So one way to do it is I can utilize this reconcile offline work. Don't ever do it from your root project, just like you don't ever mark for add the root. Anybody remember why you don't do the root? The library, right? You don't want the library folder on the depot. So I'm only going to do it as high as the assets. If you go lower, it's better off. But when I hit reconcile offline work on my assets folder, you'll see Perforce is going to think right now. It's scanning. Basically what it's doing is it's looking through my assets folder to look for anything different or changed or new or anything missing. What's that?
If it's like 1 of 2, then it's going to check out that it's 2 of 2.
Yeah, exactly. So it's looking for anything new or different, and this window will pop up. Okay, so definitely look at this window. The amount of times students will reconcile and just hit boom, reconcile, I'm done, right? And they don't even know what they're actually changing. But take a look at this window. So this is what Perforce, this is basically saying, hey, this is what I found on your computer that isn't on the depot or that's different. So it's broken down into 3 windows. So here are basically modified files. These files here, these are going to be checked out. These files down here are all things that it found that are on my computer that I haven't yet added to the depot. So maybe you have some things that you, from your visuals assignment that you didn't add, or things that are new to you, then they will come in here. Down here in this final window, this is going to show if you've deleted something from your workspace, it will show up here and it's going to mark those files for delete. So be careful. If you've deleted your local copies of things and then you go to reconcile, it's going to mark all those for delete. So just be careful when you get to this. Say you don't want to add things, you can just go, you can go ahead and just check this off, right? Like say, oh, I actually don't want to add this third-person controller script, so I'm going to turn this one off, right? That's totally fine. Actually go through this list and see what it found. So when you hit reconcile, you'll see what it's actually doing is it's just adding those files to a change list for me, right? So I'm back to where I started, to where if I just checked things out, or if I just went to these files and hit mark for add. It's not really doing anything that drastically different. It's just a way to scan your whole folder or your whole project for any changes or differences. So now that I'm basically back to where I am, I'm just going to go ahead and submit this change list. I'm just going to say completed experiment 2.5. So we're not yet done. And I'll say reconcile offline work example. So don't get in the habit of doing that. How that can be super dangerous is, say you're in a team setting, right? Everyone is working together on a team and no one's decided we're all just going to reconcile offline work. What could go wrong? So I'm working on my scene. I come to Unity. I'm making changes to my level. And then my teammate says, hey, I just submitted something to the depot. Go ahead and get latest. So me not thinking, I'm like, okay, cool. Let me go ahead and get latest. So I come to the assets and I get latest revision. Anybody have a guess what might happen?
You're going to override the work you just did.
You're going to overwrite everything, right? Because you've been working on read-only files this whole time. Perforce didn't know that you had those changes. If in that same scenario you had checked out your files and were working on them, you can still get latest revision, and that's okay because Perforce knows you're changing them. So be careful. You can definitely lose work this way. You can definitely get very lost, and some students will look at reconcile offline work as this magic button. Like, I don't have to go in Perforce, but then when I do, I can just reconcile and everything will be fixed. It doesn't work that way. But if you use it where it's actually powerful, like usually in beta for the Des 3 teams when they're working on materials and things, if materials aren't showing up as a team, it's most likely these meta files, right? If you look, how everything has meta files. If those aren't being updated properly, your team might have pink textures. So reconcile is a good way to scan and see if those differences haven't yet been added. So with that, knowing that, you should now understand everything you need for the Perforce test. That was the one little bit of information I didn't give you in the beginning because it can be a lot to understand, as well as the whole Perforce interface. So reconcile offline work is definitely important, but don't make it your main workflow. And one other thing I'm going to do, I'll showcase this if I haven't already, is well, for the rest of the experiment, I'm going to go ahead and check out the whole IND. Let's just check out the whole scenes folder. Right? I'm going to check out the whole scenes folder. I don't know what I'm going to change yet, but I'm going to change something in here. Same thing for my wind turbine experiments folder. Let's go ahead and check out this whole folder. Okay? Now let's come back to Unity and keep going. So now we have our script and we have it functioning. The next thing we're going to do is just add a sound effect. All right, so the first thing we're going to need for for the audio itself, is we're going to import some audio sound effects that have been provided to you. So if you right-click on the assets and import package, go ahead and import a custom package. If we navigate to the IND content folder, inside the entryway, we've got this turbine audio package. If you open this up, you'll see there should just be 3 sound effects: a turn on, a turn off, and a wind loop. Let's go ahead and import those. And it looks like they're importing into So it looks like they imported into, see, turbine assets. So inside your scenes, IND turbine assets, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move them. Let's drop them in my one folder just to stay organized. Let's go ahead and delete that empty folder now. I will adjust that in the future, so hopefully it will just import right into this folder. So now we have our 3 audio clips here, and we're going to have these play at corresponding times, right, based on when the player has some input. So on the control trigger itself, let's go ahead and add an audio source. So with Unity, Unity by default is built off of the 3D sounds, and they function really great. So always think to yourself, what is actually making the sound effect, right? Put the audio source on the actual object that's making the sound. So that way, you know, if it's like a motor running, right, it's just like a general humming noise in the level, as the player is farther away from it, it will be farther, you know, as they get closer, it will be louder. So take that into account. Don't just put them on any random object and have it play. Put it in the vicinity of the object. You can come down here to the 3D sound settings and start to mess with the minimum and maximum distance. Right, so here you'll see that blue circle. Might be a little tough to see on the projector, but you'll see in here is that is what's actually that minimum distance. So you have to be that close to hear the sound effect. So with ours, it's just going to be on input, so it's not as crucial as, like, say, an ambient sound effect in a level, but definitely mess with some of those controls when you start to build your level. So inside the audio source, here you'll see this audio clip, right? So here we want to actually play, what sound effect do we want to play, right? We're going to have our turn on sound effect. I'm just going to drag it from the project into here. You can also hit the little circle next to it, right? And that'll pop up a list of all the sounds included in the project you have. All right, so now we have that sound effect. One thing I also like to do is, you'll see this play on awake right here. So I'm going to go ahead and just play, make sure the sound effect is actually working. Make sure the wave file isn't corrupted or broken, right? You heard that ding noise? So we know it's working. So now that we know that, we're going to turn off this play on awake because we don't want it to play as soon as the level starts. All right, so the next thing we're going to need to do is just modify our script just slightly. And what you're going to start to understand with this is it's a lot of the same thing. We're just doing it a little bit differently. So first, right, we had this private animator, right? And we got access to the animator, right? So now what you should start to think to yourself is it's all just components. So now I want to get access to an audio source. So let's do the same thing. Private audio source. And let's name it something. Let's say control audio. All right, So now it's the same thing. We have this component that we want to get access to. So down here in the start function, we want to define this control audio, right? Where is it? What object is it located on? So control audio equals, all right, and now for this one, we're going to write a get component, and this is angle brackets audio source. It's the same thing as animator, except, you know, just a different component that we're getting access to. And now, can anybody tell me why on line 16 I'm including here turbine pivot.getComponent, and here on line 18 I just say getComponent? Does anyone know the difference between these two? What you got? Even if it's a guess, it's okay.
Does it have to do with the fact that you're not interacting directly with the game? Well, you're still interacting with the game object, so.
Not sure?
Not sure.
All right, so when you write getComponent, what this means is you're getting the component that's on this game object, right? So our control turbine script, right? This script itself, if we go back and look at Unity, this control turbine script is on this control trigger. So when we say get component, we can get other components on this same game object. So when I say get component audio source, I'm getting this one that's right here because it's on this same game object. When I come over here and I say turbine pivot.getComponent, I'm getting the animator that's on the turbine pivot. Okay? So here, this is just a reference. If we go to Unity and we look here, okay, so our turbine pivot is pivot underscore animate me. That's just a game object. When we say here, we're getting this animator. All right? So get component, you're getting components on the same game object. If you expose a game object here and do game, or you know, the name of the object.getComponent, you can get it on any other object in the world. This is basically the same thing as writing game object.getComponent, right? Because that's just referencing itself. Right? I think it's lowercase. Yeah, there we go. So that's the same thing, right? Game object.getComponent, but people don't write that because it's just understood. I'll leave it there for now, but you don't need that game object in the dot. So now we have access to this audio source. All we need to do now is just play it when we want it to play, right? And we want that to happen right here. So when they activate it, we want it to play the turn on sound. Control audio, and it's super complex and very difficult. We're just going to write control audio dot play. That's it, right? And that's just going to play the sound effect. You'll see if you look at the dot operator, there's a few others like play delayed, play one shot. I'm pretty sure this will like play it and then it will either destroy the component or just not have access to it. So that's, you know, that could be helpful. I know there's some times where you'll have like voiceovers that just play repeatedly over and over, right? Every time you enter a volume. Things like that will give you that, that control, right? We're just going to use the play to have it play every time they activate. All right, and then let's go ahead and put that same thing right down here. So that sound effect is also going to play when they turn it off. So let's go ahead and test that. Make sure it's working. All right, so I press E. You hear the sound, it turns on. You hear the sound and it turns off. All right, so we made progress so far. Now the next thing we want to do is add a sound effect for almost like an ambient noise of the wind playing, right? So again, think about where the sound is coming from. So it's coming from the wind turbine itself. So let's go ahead and put it on the pivot object. So I'm going to just add a component, add the audio source. Let's add in the clip we want to play, which is going to be the wind loop. We can turn off the play on awake, and let's turn on the loop. So this way it's going to play over and over again as long as the clip is going. We want it to keep playing. And now this is very, very similar to what we just did. So it's just a lot of copy and paste. So let's grab this private audio source. let's just rename this to wind audio. And then let's copy this line, because remember, our audio is on our turbine object. So we're going to need to say turbine pivot.getComponent. And instead of the anim, this is going to be wind audio. And this is going to be audio source. Right? So wind audio equals turbine pivot get component audio source, which is pivot get component audio source right here. All right, now that we've done that, again, we just want to play it at the appropriate time. So let's come down here to control audio.play, copy this, and change it to wind audio.play. All right. And then we can paste the same thing down here. Instead of play, we're just going to say stop. Because it's looping, this is going to keep playing once we hit this off. So we wanted to actually, the wind noise to turn off when the wind turbine turns off. So let's go ahead and save this. Come back to Unity and let's test it out. So you hear the sound, and now that whirling wind noise is just going to keep playing as long as it's turned on. And when I press E, you hear the ding, and then the sound turns, the wind turns off. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and save this. And then the last thing we're going to go ahead and do is a little bit more advanced, but definitely very beneficial in doing some interesting things. Is just doing an audio clip swapping. Right, so we're going to take this, if we look on the control trigger, we have this turn on audio clip, right? But what we want to do, rather than having another game object with another audio source, you can totally do it that way, but rather than having multiples, what we want to do is just switch this clip out, right? So as soon as the player presses E, we want to switch it to another clip, so when they press E again, it plays a different sound. All right? So to do that, it's not as hard as it actually may seem. So we have this right here, right? We have this private audio source, control audio, right? We have access to that. What we then want to do, let's go ahead and create two public audio clips. So public audio clip, turn on, and let's create another public audio clip, turn off. So because they're public, we're going to be able to drag and drop right in Unity which clips we want those to be assigned to. All right, and then basically right before it actually plays, we want to go ahead and switch that clip itself. So right here, right before the line right before it plays, we're going to say control audio dot clip and set this equal to turn on. All right, and now if we copy this line and come down here, we're going to control audio.clip equals turn off. So we can actually dynamically change the clip that's being played from one audio source. All right, so let's go ahead and save this. Oh, actually, let me just change this to left, the volume, just because. So the last thing we need to do is on the control trigger now, we'll have in our script, we have two audio sources exposed. So turn on, it's going to be our turn on sound effect. Turn off is our turn off sound effect. Let's go ahead and test this and see if it actually works. All right, so come up to it. Plays that on sound effect. I press E again. Nothing. All right, let me test the clip itself. Okay, it turned it back to on. All right, and it's not playing. Did I not switch it? Oh, I did the same thing last month. I swear. I put this on the line after it's playing. So that's not good. I want to put this before, right? So I want to switch the clip before it actually tells it to play. So let's see if that fixes my mistake. All right, press E. Turns on. Let me select the pivot so we can see the, no, control trigger. Hopefully we can see it switch. Press E again, and it plays a different effect. And then if I press it again, it should play the on sound and off. All right. So now let's go ahead and save the scene, save the project, select the prefab, and definitely make sure you get in the habit of select the one in the scene and hit apply, right? This is actually applying your changes to the prefab in the project down here. So now when I go ahead and drop in multiple of these, right, everything comes intact. So real quick, why it's important to actually put your animator on this object and not this master right here. If you put your animator on here, this is going to be using space that's local to the actual object, which is also the same as the scene, right? By putting it inside of an object, we can move this anywhere in the world, right? And it's not going to matter because this distance, right, this 20 value here and this 0, 0, 0 in the rotation, this is all in reference to this right here. So if I rotate this like so, this should still behave just like normal, right? Even though it may be off over there to the angle, when I press E, it's still going to rotate based on its own rotation because it's not oriented, or it's not the direct child to the scene. So you can look as the scene as this is the parent object to all these child objects. So if it's the direct child, it's going to be affected by the scene. So when you go to move your whole level and attach it to someone else's, if you don't have your animation set up this way inside of an empty like this, you might run into issues. So just make sure you start to get in the habit of building out your hierarchy and understanding where your animator actually goes. So now that I'm all saved, I should be able to come to Perforce. And remember, I checked out everything that I was working on, right? I checked out all the scenes as well as the whole wind turbine experiments folder down here. So what you can really do, and why I did this, was to utilize this revert unchanged files. If I haven't shown it already, this seems to be one that students really start to gravitate towards because it's quick and it's easy and it's very easy to understand as well. So remember, revert files is going to take everything out of your changes, completely remove it. Revert unchanged is going to pull out everything that's still the exact same. So I checked out all the scenes, but I maybe only made a change to 1 or 2 of them. So when I hit revert unchanged, it's going to leave me with only the files that need to be submitted that are different, right? So it looks like my prefab has been changed, my script has now changed, and the scene itself was changed. So now I can go ahead and submit those changes. Wait, let me think first. There was audio that I added, so I just want to double check. And you can use the icons here, right? These, you can tell these are just blank pieces of paper. You know, it might be hard to see on there, but the icons will show you what objects, what assets aren't on the depot. And let's go ahead and just drag and drop them into the change list, showing another way to do the same thing. Right now they're marked for add, and then submit. Completed. And all right, so now I've got all 3 submitted. I'm good to go. So just a reminder, so you remember, when you go to actually turn in your entryway or turn in your executable, make sure you come to your ASCORE level manager and change this to be the name of the scene you want to load. So to demonstrate, I'm going to do the IND2 wind turbine. When you work on your actual assignment, you'll be working in the, the assignment for a submission would be the entryway. So I'll come here, let's just hit add open scenes. You can even remove this one, we don't need it for now. And let's make a build. You can do the same thing where you go section 0, compiled, come right to the assignment. And again, you're not turning in your wind turbine, I'm just demonstrating what you'll do for your entryway. Okay, open that, same thing. And then by creating that folder, now when I make this build, everything's going to be contained right in that folder for me, ready to be submitted. So while that's building, let me go ahead and show you a few previous examples. Yeah, we got a few minutes and then I'll let you go. So if you look at the assignment itself, right, so after you do that, after you walk through those experiments, you now understand everything you need to make a door. It's the same concepts, right? Instead of a pivot, we're rotating a hinge instead. So this is what's going to be expected of you right here. So you can do something traditional like this or like the door you see here, but don't just think that you can phone it in. Really put effort into it. I showed this example here because this was a very, very solid example of just a simple thing that was done very well that put a lot of detail in, right? He actually had hinges here, so when the door opened, a hinge would open with the door, and all of that is just setting up your hierarchy, and just his attention to detail was very, very impressive. So definitely strive for something realistic and functioning if you're going to stick to a traditional door. If you feel comfortable that you want to maybe push yourself to make something a bit more creative, or maybe you have a specific door in your level that you're planning on building, that's also totally acceptable to build for this assignment. As long as you stick to the requirements, which are you have to have a frame, which is part of the door that doesn't physically move, and you have to have a quote-unquote handle, right? So if you're doing something more like this door, the handle is, I refer to it as an interaction point. So we're not yet worried about bringing text on screen or yet worried about how players know where to interact. We're doing it based on the visuals in the level. So if you have a doorway that has a handle, I'm expecting when I walk up to the handle, that's where the interaction point is, not some other random place somewhere else. So if you want to do something more creative, that's okay. You just want to build something that showcases this is where you interact. Here's another really good example. And rather than show you the images, I'll just pull them up and run the executables. Should still have them. Oh. All right, so when I come up to this, I press E. Door opens, it plays a sound effect. And I also want you to make sure you're playing two different sound effects, right? You should have an open sound effect and a closed sound effect. Right, so again, so you can see with this was very well done because this is a good example of making sure you set up your hierarchy in the proper way. So rather than having 8 animations and 8 animators, he had his root object, and then each one of these pieces that's moving was a child of that, and his animator was on the root, right? So it plays the animation, and all 8 pieces move at once. And let me go ahead and show you another one that was very, very creative and very different. So really show you what's possible. So he had a lot of good feedback built in. So when I press E on this one, sound effect's a little long, but not a big deal. You'll see now that the eye is lit up, right? It has a little pulse to it. Good feedback, already a lot better than I'm expecting. But that's the type of stuff you should be thinking about. So when both are pressed, the door opens, and he implemented an actual trigger state, which we talked about with the booleans and the triggers. So now as I walk up to it, so it's transitioning to that byte state, right? I enter the volume, the trigger is hit, it goes to the byte state, it plays the animation, and then it goes back to the open state, all right? So the previous example I just showed you, make sure you follow that to where I can open it on one side, I can walk through and close it on the other side, or go back through. This student did a great job, but then he did this. And I can't get back now. So if you're going to do something creative, still try to stick to the assignment, even if it, or please stick to the assignment, even if you're going to modify it for your level, just at least make it to where the player can interact on both sides. And let's see if I have, I'll show you one from last month. Oh, I don't have it. All right, and if I look up, let me pull up the, oh, that one finished quick. Let me play this one. This is another really good one, just, more of the same, I guess, but he had a small little addition where he had the button here, had a little animation on it. So again, setting up your hierarchy in a logical way, right? So, the button being pressed is all part of the same animation. But yeah, definitely a lot of different options there. You'll look, if you see in the assignment, let me pull it up again. You can really go nuts and actually start to build a lot of functionality with this. So here is the loop you're going to be building. There are going to be 4 states to your doorway: closed, open, opened, and closed, right? These are the door actually opening and closing. So you're going to have 4 states right there, but you can see from a state machine like this, or a mechanism system like this, there's a lot you can do, right? You can have this lock system, and then basically in your script, check if if the player's collected a certain object, change a boolean to a value, right? If that boolean's changed, it's now the door's unlocked. So focus on just these 4 states, but then you can really start to branch out and make more functionality out of what we've just learned. So this is recorded. You will be able to watch it again.